Welcome to St. Paul's on a beautiful, beautiful evening. Really glad to have you all here, and it's really an honor for me to welcome you. I'm Seth Raymond. I'm the priest here at St. Paul's. I've been here for about 3 years, and it's been a true joy over those few years to develop a closer connection with St. John's on the Lake, which I know we have. Shout out to St. John's. Anybody? Yeah! All right, it's going to be a party tonight. I don't know if you knew this. All right, so it's been really great to have a really close connection with St. John's on the Lake over the past few years and get the chance personally to serve on their board of directors, also to share what little wisdom I have in Advent and Lenten book studies at St. John's, and then to be part of the Symposium on Aging, which of course this is the first event for this year's Symposium on Aging, Breaking New Ground. And I am really thrilled to have you all here. My wife, who is approximately my age, said something snide about me being a participant in such an event. And I said, well, we are all aging. I think we should and can acknowledge that. Yes. And really this event is meant to prepare folks who might be on the younger end of the aging spectrum for what it means to be an elder, to be wise, to live into our identity as people along that age spectrum. And also for those who are in the middle of that swath, or those at the older end of that swath, to figure out what does it mean? What is the significance of aging? What can we bring to bear from many different disciplines? And so I'm really excited tonight that we get to engage with music in that way, to ask this question: how does music help us understand memory, meaning-making, aging? So it's a real joy tonight. I'm going to stop talking here 1 minute, as promised. It's a real joy for me to welcome tonight our choir master, organ director, organist, music director, director of music and liturgy, Dr. Alex Jones, who is the director of music and liturgy here at St. Paul's. To provide a lecture on that topic for about 20-25 minutes or so. We'll take a brief break. If you need during that brief break to use the restroom, there are restrooms just in the hallway here. You can reach them by those 3 stairs, or there's a ramp right over here. You can go up that ramp and then just across the hall to get to those restrooms. And then we'll reconvene for the kind of main event as far as music goes, which is these wonderful pieces of masterworks that Alex has prepared. So without further ado, Alex Jones.
Thank you, Seth. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to St. Paul's. It's a joy to be here, and thank you for braving the elements. I couldn't have picked a worse day weather-wise to do this little presentation this evening, but I'm so glad that you're all here and that you're able to warm up in our nice, cozy, historic space that we have here. So this lecture and recital is offered really as Seth said, as a prelude to the upcoming Symposium on Aging offered by St. John's. I'm so delighted to be a participant in this really important event, and it is my hope that this evening also furthers a closer artistic and spiritual collaboration between St. Paul's and St. John's, since obviously both institutions have a very long history together. In the beginning, I was asked to devise a musical program that would encompass aspects of the overall symposium theme of breaking new ground. But given our current position within the Christian liturgical calendar, I also saw this as a valuable opportunity to offer a musical commentary on the season of Lent, with music that conveys the affect of Passiontide in a really dramatic way, and which also can be considered groundbreaking. So while it might feel as though much of tonight's music is a little bit on the heavier side of things, I hope to show that this remarkable body of organ repertoire is as fascinating and as exciting as it is introspective and challenging. So I'm going to discuss a carefully selected collection of German Romantic organ masterworks from the 19th century, and I'm going to explain briefly how these pieces forge new paths at the time, with emphasis on how they are specifically informed by the concepts of memory. We all know that when we hear music, it can conjure powerful images in our minds that may be the products of our own subconscious, or which evoke certain feelings or a sense of place. In the 19th century, it was often the case that music, literature, and the visual and dramatic arts were all regarded on an equal footing, certainly in terms of their respective validity or importance. But this idea, of course, isn't new. The ancient Greeks believed likewise that all art should be regarded with equal critique and enjoyed with equal measure, as each form was perceived to have the same power to communicate something as the other. So my aim, therefore, is to sort of explore two principal questions briefly through a little examination of the repertoire that I'll be playing this evening. And that is, why is it that music can evoke certain memories in the listener, and how do these composers achieve this? Technology works. Yes, excellent. So, Felix Mendelssohn, Franz Liszt, and Julius Goldker. By the way, if you can't see the screen, I have a handout, and everything is in a handout, so please feel free to browse through that. These composers all inhabit a place in music history that was deeply influenced through the work of earlier figures such as Bach and Beethoven. Bach's extraordinary work in the development of complex counterpoint and text setting, particularly in the cantatas, and Beethoven's in the expansion of the classical sonata form with forays into a more adventurous harmonic vocabulary, came to define a set of practices that later composers of the High German Romantic period expanded upon. The 19th century also saw a birth of extraordinary virtuosity within keyboard literature, and one key byproduct of this was a visceral capacity to communicate a superimposed musical narrative. In the 1840s, Liszt had reached the pinnacle of his touring career, giving great recitals entirely from memory, which was a new feat at the time, and arguably why most concert pianists mostly play from memory today. The international fame that he garnered on the back of his amazing capacity for memorization and abilities as a composer was so great that the admiration he received from his audiences began being referred to as Listomania, not unlike what the Beatles were experiencing in the early 1960s. And there's a little cartoon in your handout which I encourage you to look at, which is something of a caricature of what this was like. So because of his commitment to memorizing his recitals, this garnered an amazingly enigmatic persona in the eye of the public. There was something iconoclastic about his stage presence and the music he rendered at the piano, which was often at a level of technical difficulty that only he could achieve at the time. This is significant because throughout the 19th century, the perception of the artist as a somewhat mysterious, isolated, tragic figure who was somehow untouchable or impossible to understand in the eyes of the masses was becoming a sort of more commonplace artistic raison d'etre. Indeed, other lenses through which we can draw these comparisons also exist within the visual literary arts. Take, for example, Emily Bronte's character of Heathcliff from her seminal Gothic tragedy, Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is portrayed as a morally ambiguous figure of mixed descent, as Bronte describes it, like a gypsy, and someone who has dubious motives. Yet his powers of attraction over Catherine Earnshaw and the toxicity of the relationship that unfolds because of their intertwining is the unmistakable force that glues this whole story together. So in my opinion, it's not too far-fetched to liken this relationship to that of the relationship that figures like Liszt and Wagner and Goldker had with their audiences. A brilliant-minded artist focused squarely on the ambition of conquering themselves and their art at the expense of everything and everyone else around them. And often this had tragic real-world consequences. And we can all too readily recall the sad fate that plagued Robert Schumann after the damage he inflicted onto his hands and mental health in a bid to become one of the great virtuoso pianists of the time, whose love for his wife Clara had consumed him in psychologically very unhealthy ways. Alternatively, we can consider some of the paintings. Oh, is it not moving? Well, I encourage you to look at your book again. That's exactly why I made it, in case of technological thingamajig. So you'll see a painting by Caspar David Friedrich. And this is an artist whose work I constantly associate with Liszt and Reuter especially. In particular, his painting from 1818 titled Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is what you're looking at. And to me, this sort of perfectly encapsulates the idea of the tragic artist and their quest to attain something greater than their mortal selves. You can see in the painting, see how Friedrich focuses in the perspective to the centre of the portrait, as if the figure possesses this kind of mysterious magnetism, and we're going into their inner thoughts and struggles, as it were. Indeed, in my opinion, this image most certainly applies to the young Royker, who was a star student of Liszt, and I will touch on this a little bit later. I believe we can surmise that the ideas of memory, in terms of the act of memorizing music and the effect of performing music in a memorized way, absolutely impacts the artist's relationship with the audience. The influence of past composers and a burning desire to forge new directions in the same spirit as the concurrent industrial revolution cannot be divorced from how music changed, and most importantly, how the act of making music became such a significant component of the artistic equation. The author and scholar Northrop Frye wrote a really interesting book. It's pretty long-winded, but he makes very good points. It's called Narrative Archetypes, a critique, theory, and method of narrative analysis. And in this book, he sort of introduces this idea of diegesis and mimesis, so the idea of showing and telling. And he explains that this is intrinsic to how a musician communicates with their audience, not just through the notes that they play, but with the physicality and with the gesture that they employ to play the notes. Essentially, he argues that following the introduction of memorized performance as a standard practice among virtuoso concert musicians, artists were able to find a higher plane of communication that went beyond relying on the musical acumen of their audiences. So in other words, it was no longer necessary to have a sort of a rigorous grasp of academic musical concepts in order to discover or feel something when experiencing a performance of music. So given that the organ in particular is by far the most physically involved and difficult of the family of keyboard instruments to play, I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that Frye's argument actually holds considerable weight when considered in the context of the works that I'm going to be playing this evening. So one of the ways that the new German school composers, primarily Liszt and Wagner, forged these new paths was to adopt what we call a programmatic element in their music. This wasn't completely without precedent. It could be argued that Beethoven's Sixth Symphony is the first example of programmatic music because it has the subtitle Pastoral, and we all know the first movement. Familiar tune, yeah? So each individual movement in that symphony can be described as representing a scene in the countryside, so folk dances in springtime, sheep grazing in the field, a thunderstorm, etc. So in Liszt's case, there are numerous examples of these kind of grand orchestral portraits that he calls symphonic tone poems. And examples of this genre, such as Orpheus, tell the story of a tragically fated muse's attempt to find and rescue his love, Eurydice, from the depths of the underworld. And it succeeds in doing this without conveying any sung libretto or written text. Similarly, Mendelssohn also engages his audience by composing a series of songs without words for the piano, leaving the listener to devise the extra musical narrative for themselves. The idea of programmatic music, though, wasn't exclusively limited to Germany. In 1830, 15 years before the premiere of Mendelssohn's Six Organ Sonatas, the young French composer Hector Berlioz conducted the premiere of his much-loved Symphonie Fantastique, which came to completely change the expectations of audiences with regard to what an orchestral symphony can and should be. The programmatic element in Berlioz's case was the use of what he described as an idée fixe. This is a recurring idea, a melodic fragment that keeps returning in various guises throughout each of the 5 movements. And famously, Wagner, with his great ring cycle operas, took this idea to entirely new heights, with each of the 4 operas displaying a vast musical tableau. But in reality, this sort of 18 plus hours of music is only derived from really 25 different themes. So actually, he was composing very economically, I would argue. Some musicologists have claimed that in the case of Symphonie Fantastique, the idée fixe that Berlioz uses was inspired by his ardent love and infatuation with the Irish actress Harriet Smithson. But we also know that the symphony was composed in several inspired bursts while Berlioz was under the influence of opium, which might explain why so much of the imagery in the work is related to sort of dark Gothic horror. And we only need to look at the 5th movement of Symphonie Fantastique to understand this, because he uses the Dies Irae, or Day of Wrath, Gregorian chant, and he titles the last movement Night of the Witches' Sabbath, so make of that what you will. The combination has been, that combination was hitherto unheard of for a secular orchestral symphony. There is something about the terrifying nature of the fantasy behind it that keeps us returning to the piece frequently. So, if you'll go to the next figure in your booklet, you'll see an old engraving of the organ, and you'll see a picture of Prince Albert playing for Mendelssohn and Queen Victoria. So his 6 organ sonatas, I 365, Mendelssohn's a more conservative approach to the programmatic idea, but certainly a more spiritually inspired one. The final sonata of the set that I'm going to be playing this evening is unorthodox in form, but it entirely fits the idea of breaking new ground in terms of how it operates musically. The sonatas have an interesting history in that Mendelssohn was commissioned in the early 1840s by the British sheet music publisher Coventry and Collier to write a set of commentaries for the organ that could be used either in church or for concerts. But given his impulsive creativity, these pieces gradually morphed into the multi-movement works that we know today and are as essential to the organist's repertoire as the works of Bach. Significantly, many of them were premiered by the composer on the grand organ of Birmingham Town Hall, which is what you're looking at in your handout. And interestingly, both Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were often in attendance at Mendelssohn's organ recitals. They became great friends with the Mendelssohns during that time. The sonatas were groundbreaking for the time because of their highly pianistic textures, which would later influence Liszt and Reuter's forays into writing for the organ. And crucially, new organs were beginning to appear in secular spaces, such as town halls. And this meant that the organ was gradually becoming a more orchestral instrument into itself. And you'll hear in the repertoire that I'll play tonight various solos on the oboe and the clarinet and the strings. And so the organ just sort of became this whole new thing in the 19th century. And I'd like to think that I can speak with some personal experience on Mendelssohn's relationship to the organ, especially concerning Birmingham, because I was fortunate enough to hold a scholarship position during my time as an undergraduate in Birmingham, in which I had regular access to the Birmingham Town Hall organ, and I was able to play that instrument frequently and explore it. And another random fact about that place that's just occurred to me is that that venue was also the first place where Charles Dickens gave the first public reading of A Christmas Carol. It's a wonderful building, and it's been beautifully restored over the years. The organ is fantastic, so look it up on YouTube. So considering aspects of memory and influence in the Sixth Sonata, Mendelssohn was clearly inspired by the chorale-based works of Bach when composing it. It's based on the Lutheran chorale Vaterunser in Himmelreich, which, as we know, is the Our Father. We know this because the piece begins with a presentation of the chorale in a completely straightforward statement, before then embarking on a series of variations on the melody. So the first movement, therefore, is constructed as a theme of variations, which was really unusual, even for the 1840s. Because even then, the expectation of a multi-movement instrumental sonata still relied on the conventional three-section sonata form, exposition, development, recapitulation for the first movement. He then incorporates a short fugue and puts it in place of the second movement, and like other conclusion and final performance for many decades. And finally, the third movement is a slow andante and is based on the hymn tune of Tide and Cross. And this is significant because it shows a clear trajectory between, the dark, brooding plea of the chorale at the beginning, before giving way to something hopeful, as this final movement is written in the major key. So we could surmise that the variations heard in the first movement might represent, in terms of memory, man's struggle and tumult before finally attaining comfort. Furthermore, it was also unusual to end the three-movement sonata with a slow finale. That was also a new thing. So moving forward a decade, Liszt had retired from the busy life of touring by the 1850s to find respite and solitude in the city of Weimar, where he spent his remaining years devoting his time to teaching, conducting, and composing. In 1854, he received a commission for a new organ work to be written for the dedication of a substantial new organ that was being built by the German organ builder Friedrich Madegast for the cathedral in Merseburg. And you have the specification of the organ, for those of you who are so inclined, you have the specification of the organ in front of you in your handouts. The organist, Alexander Winterberger, was an acquaintance of Liszt at the time, and he had been appointed the cathedral organist at Merseburg at the time the dedication was due to take place. So before the commission, Liszt produced an introspective and tumultuous set of variations on Weinen, Klagen, Sorgen, Sagen, which loosely translates as weeping, lamenting, and despairing. The thematic text and melody of the work is derived from the Crucifixus movement, from Bach's D minor Mass, which in itself is in the form of a Passacaglia, so it's an ostinato repeating melody upon which the different variations are built. The original prelude on Weinen Klagen was written for the piano, but in keeping with the fashion at the time, Winterberger had made a transcription for the organ with Liszt's approval, and this is the version we'll be hearing this evening. So how is it groundbreaking, and how does it evoke memory? Well, it's worth noting that the piece demands some very exacting colours of the organ which were not available on German organs even 20 to 30 years prior to the construction of the notable cathedral instrument. So no doubt both Liszt and Winterberg wanted to show off its unique sonorities. And here you can see some of the recommendations of some really unusual sound combinations as shown in figure 8 in your handout. And you'll notice that he requests in the score to use a stop called the 32-foot Borden, which would have only been considered a sound for the pedal division on a very large organ. But now we have this sound available in the hands. So in other words, it gives an enormous kind of wide gravity and depth and darkness to the sound of the organ. The aural effect of this combination is gloomy. Poignantly, this passage occurs after the high intensity and drama of the climax. So in terms of memory, it sort of suggests some kind of exhaustion or fatigue on the part of the narrator. They've committed their rage and anxiety to protest their cause, but finally it's as if they succumb to resignation and acceptance. And so the piece ends very softly, using the very lowest notes of the organ to actually create a thunder effect, where the pitch that you're hearing is no longer discernible. It's just a quiet, rumble. So finally, while Liszt was working on this piece for the Würzburg organ, one of his prodigious young students, an energetic and brilliant young man by the name of Julius Reuter, was also recommended to write a large-scale work that would show off the entire organ. The extraordinary sonata on the 94th Psalm is the centerpiece of tonight's program, and is one of only two surviving complete works by this composer, as his life was tragically cut short after succumbing to tuberculosis at the tender age of just 24. Reuter was deeply influenced by Liszt's musicianship, and he came from a family of organ builders who understood the evolving landscape of organ design and the effects that it could have on musical possibilities and keyboard technique. So the 94th Psalm sonata is considered today by many organists to be perhaps the greatest contribution to the instrument's repertoire from the 19th century. It's a real tour de force, conceived along the lines of a grand symphonic poem, and it takes the text of the 94th Psalm as its program. And you'll see on the cover of your handout, I put the corresponding psalm verses into each movement so you can sort of get an idea of what's happening. The work is written in what's known as cyclic form, which means that the entire musical architecture is built upon a small handful of themes, and the work is meant to be played as one continuous, uninterrupted whole. So on your program booklet, as I said, included the corresponding psalm verses. The most prominent theme heard throughout the piece is shown in figure 9. It's gloomy, spooky, it's ambiguous with regards to key or melodic direction, and in my opinion is perhaps the most remarkable opening to a major organ work ever, because we don't know what's happening. It starts on a major second and sort of snakes its way down, and then out of nowhere there's a bit of sunshine, and then it sort of goes away again. So it's a really fascinating opening, I think. Very atmospheric. And so in terms of working memory, it seems that Reuter is recalling various tragedies throughout his short life in this piece, I think. The introduction and ensuing allegro are all kind of fire and brimstone, with the vengeance and wrath of God on full display. But the central adagio is hauntingly beautiful and has a longing quality to it, which perhaps suggests Reuter's love for Princess Marie von Sayn Wittgenstein, to whom he dedicated a short work also titled Adagio, which, having looked at the score, is actually a revised version of the same movement that we have here in the sonata. So while beautiful and hopeful, each long solo phrase in this section always gets interrupted by the reappearance of the first theme that we hear at the beginning. So it's as if to suggest perhaps some kind of unrequited love or hopeless sort of quest, if you like. So finally, I don't believe that Reuter's choice of the 94th Psalm text, around which he organises his musical ideas, is an accident, being in the knowledge that following its completion in 1858, he had been months to live after his tuberculosis condition began to worsen considerably. And it's not unreasonable, therefore, to speculate whether Reuter is expressing anger at God or other things beyond his control that gave him a terminal bout of ill health at such a young age. It's well documented that Liszt, in his correspondence with Reuter's father, described him as being prodigiously talented and as someone who looked, for all intents, to charter a new course in the direction of German music. Consequently, the 94th Psalm sonata is, in my opinion, one of the great what-ifs in music history. And who knows what he would have gone on to compose had he lived longer. So I now invite you to enjoy the intense power and cerebral drama that these great pieces give us, and I believe that we can clearly envision memories and feel emotions even though none of us ever knew or met the composers that wrote the music you're about to hear this evening. And it is this phenomenon that, to me, is the very essence of great music, regardless of where it comes from or who wrote it. So thank you very much. We'll take a short break and on the music. Thank you.
All right, so we'll take about 7 minutes, and if you'd like to get up and stretch your legs, please do. Take use of the bathrooms. If you go through this hall, and if some people mentioned they would like some water, we can probably find some water.